Friends, welcome back to the module on Tenders 101 for railway officers. In the last four modules, we have covered topics like introduction to tenders, tendering process, planning for tenders, tender invitation. And now we have reached a stage where tenders have been invited. And once it has been invited, then comes the critical stage, which is called preparation of comparative statement and briefing note. So, what is a comparative statement? A comparative statement is fairly simple. It is a simple document which is prepared by executive, and it is 100% checked by associate finance, right? And it contains details of you know the rates offered by bidders, uh, the total amount offered by bidder, the quantities, and also important tender conditions. It also has details on late and delayed tender, and I'm going to talk to you about that. So, the brief view of a very summarized view of comparative statement is similar to what you can see in the table below. So on one hand, on the column, you have all the parameters and critical parameters, and on the all the columns, you have details supplied by bidders for each of those parameters. So in this case, for example, it looks like a tender, a comparative statement for ballast supply. So it says that there's bidder X, Y, and Z. Three of them they have bidded, and the bid value offered by bidder X is 226. Bid value offered by bidder Y is in two parts: supply of 210.40 and loading of 11.4, and the bid value offered by bidder Z is 222.60. Right? It also says that the quarry source offered by bidder X is P and R, for Y is Q, and for Z is R. It also talks about the distance from where each of these bidders are supplying the quarry to the site, and any special conditions that they have set. So a comparative statement is nothing but a simple statement. It's a tabular statement, also called the tabulation, also called the tabulated statement, and it is prepared by the executive and checked 100% by associate finance, and this is perused by the tender committee. Now, we spoke about two terms. One was delayed tender, and other is a late tender. So what's the difference between these two terms? Delayed tender is one which is received after the date and time of submission, but before the time of opening of tender. So let's say that the time of submission of tender is 3 p.m. and the time of opening of tender is 3:30 p.m. So if a bid comes to us at 3:25, anywhere between 3 p.m. to 3:29 p.m., it is categorized as delayed tender. Late tender is something which is received after the time of opening, right? So if the submission time was 3 p.m., tender opening time was 3:30 p.m., and any tender which is received after 3:30 p.m., after the time of opening of tender, then it is labeled as late tender. Both delayed and late tenders are marked in red ink. Now, this terminology has been there in government tendering system from ages, but in the e-tendering system, this has lost relevance because in e-tendering system, after the time of submission, no one is allowed to submit any document. So that has precluded the possibility of delayed and late tenders. However, a lot of government authorities, they still do few tenders which are not on the e-tendering model, and in that sense, it is still relevant today. Now, so we looked at two terms right now. One was comparative statement, the other was late and delayed tender, and the third important document which is prepared after the opening of tender is briefing note, And briefing note is nothing but a note which is prepared for the briefing of tender committee. So it is prepared by the executive officer, and it is and it requires vetting of associate finance as per para 1253 of engineering code, and this is also mentioned in para 612 of finance code. So it is a very important document because tender committees tend to rely a lot on information supplied in briefing note. So what are the information which is supplied on briefing note? Now, it has a standard set of information like tender notice number, description of works, all the details which are there in the tender notice, for example, approximate cost of work, uh, number of approved contractors to whom tender notice was sent, if it was the case of limited tender, number of tenders sold, number of tenders received, number of tenders opened, date of opening of tender. Then it has original tenders which has been filled by the original tender document prepared by the executive and the which is placed, and it is marked, the pages are marked, and it has uh, the comparative statement that we talked about. So comparative statement also forms part of briefing note. And then it has some hygiene details like number of tenders which have been accompanied with requisite earnest money deposit. So if tenders are, as you are aware, if tenders are without requisite earnest money deposit, then they are considered as null and void. So it is not considered. Now, other than details of, what we talked about, briefing note also has details of status of approved plan, status of the sanction estimate. It also has status of NS items and rates which are included in the tender schedule. So if there are NS items, then does it have the right approvals? Uh, then briefing note has something which is very important and used very much by the tender committee is last accepted rate for similar work in the same or contiguous area, right? So if I have a last supply rate, and let us say that this rate is in Baroda division for Karachia yard, then we would look for rates for ballast supply in Karachia yard, or region which is contiguous to Karachia yard. So it could be D cabin or BRCP, so or BRCY, and we look at all the rates in that area and use that as reference for coming to decisions in tender. Now, if rate for similar area is not available uh, for the recent times or years, then we look for contiguous area. So, the profile of area should be as similar as possible to Karachia yard. So we would look for other yards, access conditions, how easy or difficult it is to reach to that location where the last has to be supplied, and then use all those information for the rate analysis. Just in case there is no last accepted rate available, then rate analysis is also supplied at this time. For residential building, it is it is important to have comparison of rate with respect to ceiling cost. Then if there are any specific comments by tenderers on special conditions of contract, then we would like to have those specific conditions of contract uh, as a part of the briefing note. And if any of those conditions have financial implications, then comments on those items, and also what are the financial implications and assessment of those financial implications uh, is supplied with. Then comments on the working conditions of site. So for example, if the site is on a heavy train movement area, which means the site working conditions could be difficult. So those specific details have to be brought out in the briefing note. Then the details of any special circumstances that might affect rates in that area. For example, if we are living in COVID times, then uh, and if labor is not available, then uh, an assessment of what is the impact of COVID on labor rate becomes important. If there is a sudden shortage of, let's say, uh, uh, any items or any resources in that area, or if there is some sort of political unrest which affects work, then all those things, it is important to bring out all the things which can have bearing on the rate decisions for the tender committee. And last but not the least, one of the most important aspect of briefing note is to comment on the eligibility criteria which is mentioned in the tender, and these could be in the terms of technical competence, capacity of the bidder to execute work, their financial standing, etc. So the gist of briefing note uh, uh, is that it has to help tender committee. It is a note which is supplied to tender committee, which will help them in coming to right decisions. So with this, we end this session. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop me an email at the email ID shivesh@entrepreneurship.edu.in. Thank you. Thanks, Atan.